On the last video we looked at Purgatory and this cruel man-made fabrication of a dead person being purged, being tortured because they still had sin in them even after they apparently confessed their sins to a priest. Even though they're given the last rites, so on and so forth, they still weren't good enough to go straight to heaven. And we looked at a couple of verses in the New Testament which dealt with this deadly heresy, which sadly is still taught in Catholic churches to this day. I want to spend a few moments looking at another heresy which is still endemic in the Catholic Church, and that is, of course, confessing sins to the priest. Confession is something which has been around a long time in the Church of Rome. However, in recent years, most Catholics don't go to confession anymore, even though Roman Catholicism says that they are minded to, indeed, to not go to confession and to receive the sacraments is a mortal sin. And if you die in mortal sin, you go to hell, according to Catholicism. Now, most Catholics, when it comes to the subject of what is sinful, have interesting views. In 1968, Pope Paul VI issued an encyclical called Humanae Vitae, and in this epistle, Pope Paul VI said that contraception of any kind was sinful, and of course he put abortion right at the top. The problem is most Catholics didn't actually agree with him. Even in 1968, anybody observing Catholic congregations anywhere in the Western world would be pushed to find any more than 4 children per family. Today, most churches, it's mum, dad and 2 kids. The Blairs have 4 children, but if they're going to be honest with themselves, they would expect to have 12 to 14 children per couple. And they haven't got this because Catholics do practice contraception. Paul VI didn't use ex cathedra to push this through because he knew that the Catholics wouldn't go along with it. The grip had gone. Now, most people who go to confession don't confess their sins of contraception and so on and so forth because they don't believe that it is a sin to practice contraception. And I want to look at a verse today which Catholics try to use to prove this teaching of going into a box and confessing sins to a priest. Some of you have allowed your children to go into a box and tell a stranger their inner thoughts, perhaps even innocent thoughts which they thought may have been sin. They've gone in and told this priest in a cassock things that they've done, and some of you should be ashamed of yourselves for allowing your children to go into those boxes and tell these strange men sins that they believe they've committed. You wonder what social services would make of this, don't you? But James 5:16 is a verse that Catholics use to try and convince biblical illiterates of this odd doctrine. And it says, confess your faults one to another. Now, faults isn't necessarily a sin. A sin would be somebody who perhaps overeats or undereats. A sin would be somebody who spends more time talking to God about people and less time talking to people about God. A sin would be somebody who spends more time watching television and less time reading their Bible. Or a sin would be any number of sins you could look at in the flesh. But a fault isn't necessarily a sin. I believe in the context of this, a fault could be perhaps somebody holding a grudge, somebody being selfish or prideful, and of course it is a fair line between a fault and a sin. But the writer here, the Apostle James, quite clearly says fault. He could have used the word sin, and you might have a case for public confession, but he says the word is fault. Confess your faults one to another. Now we know in times gone by that women would go into the confession box and confess their sexual thoughts, their lusts, their fantasies to these bachelor priests, and of course that would make them sin, of course, because these priests many times would fulfill these fantasies, or if anything they could even blackmail their congregationalists and that has to be warned against too. But the Apostle James says to confess your faults one to another and pray one for another, that ye may be healed. Now the whole context of this is, of course, is healing. Whether it's physical healing or spiritual healing is hotly contested. I believe it is a spiritual healing. I believe the early church were under great pressure. They were persecuted left, right and centre, and they wanted to be healed spiritually, and it was taught that the elders, plural, would come and lay their hands on the sick and they'd be healed. It doesn't say send for the priest, it says send for the elders. And we know that in the 2nd century the Nicolaitans were well and truly underway. You had local churches importing outside ministers into the local congregations, and the local congregation paying the minister a flat wage. You only find something similar to that in Judges 17, and that isn't something to be boasting about. The New Testament says that a local assembly should recognise local elders, and then those local elders would be raised up to lead the congregation. Also, the nonsense of having a bishop over many churches isn't scriptural. You have elders over individual assemblies. But by all means confess your faults one to another, but the writer says that you aren't to confess your sins. That, of course, is for God. Only God alone can forgive sins. Also, if you want to force this verse to advocate Catholics going into a box and telling their priests their sins to him, then he needs to tell his sins to the church, because it does say confess your faults one to another. And when was the last time your priest confessed his faults or sins to the congregation? It hasn't happened. Neither do you find feminists in the Church of England confessing their faults or sins to the congregation. It doesn't happen. By all means confess your sins to God, and God alone will forgive you, but confessing your sins one to another is deadly, and many times it has been abused in the past. So this is a brief video on confessing sins. As I say, Catholics don't observe it, but they are minded to nonetheless. And in a future video we will be looking at more errors and heresies of Roman Catholicism. Thank you, and Maranatha.